Right now, your brain is performing one of the most complex processes that has ever appeared in the history of life, and you don't even realize it's happening. Every time you look at someone's face, read text on a screen, or simply walk across a room, billions of neural signals are racing through your brain at a speed that's almost unimaginable. But here's the truly strange part. Human eyes are actually built in a way that most modern engineers would probably call a flawed design. Your brain has to continuously fix the problems that the eyes themselves create so that you feel like you're seeing the world perfectly and seamlessly. And the deeper you dig into the history of vision, the stranger the story gets. Because humans actually still carry traces of an ancient third eye deep inside the brain. It's not mystical. It's not some secret spiritual energy, but rather the real remnants of a biological system that appeared hundreds of millions of years ago, still operating inside you right now. For many centuries, eyes were considered one of the strongest arguments against the theory of evolution. The idea sounds pretty reasonable, because when you look at a human eye, it looks more like something designed perfectly from the start than something that emerged through tiny random changes. Even Charles Darwin himself once admitted that the thought of an eye forming by natural selection sometimes felt almost absurd to him. And honestly, I understand that feeling, because the eye doesn't just detect light. It measures distance, recognizes motion, processes color, automatically adjusts brightness, and sends an enormous amount of data to the brain almost instantly. But then biologists began to realize that the eye didn't appear fully formed in one miraculous leap. The very first eyes on Earth were actually almost blind. They didn't see images. They only distinguished between light and dark. The entire history of vision began with tiny light-sensitive proteins called opsins. When light hits them, they change shape and create a simple chemical signal. And strangely enough, that ability alone was enough to create a survival advantage. A creature that could detect the direction of light, could find food better, or avoid dangerous areas a little more effectively. Evolution loves those kinds of little bits. Then the light-sensitive patches began to curve inward, forming primitive eye cups that helped determine the direction of light more accurately. Then this structure gradually started working like a pinhole camera. The first images in the history of biology began to appear that way, still blurry, still extremely simple, but useful enough to be kept. The big leap happened when transparent tissues evolved into lenses that helped focus light onto the primitive retina. And that's what I always find coolest about evolution. It didn't create perfect eyes in one spectacular jump. It built everything through countless small, almost boring changes spanning hundreds of millions of years. Vision became so effective that nature reinvented eyes dozens of times across different branches of life. Insects did it one way, squids did it another, vertebrates went in yet another direction. But what's astonishing is that almost all of them use the same genetic master switch called PAX6, meaning that deep beneath all these complex modern eyes, the same ancient logic that appeared hundreds of millions of years ago still exists. What really makes the human eye weird is that you only need to compare it with the eye of an octopus for everything to start looking very puzzling. Sounds strange, I know, but octopuses actually possess one of the most impressive visual systems on the planet. And the interesting thing is that human eyes and octopus eyes look remarkably similar on the surface, even though the two species evolved completely independently. This is what biologists call convergent evolution. Nature repeatedly arrives at the same solution because the laws of physics don't change. If you want to build a system that sees the world clearly, sooner or later you'll end up inventing something like a camera. That's why both human eyes and octopus eyes have a cornea, pupil, retina, and lens. It sounds reasonable until you look deeper into how they're actually assembled inside. And that's when the story gets weird in exactly the way I love most in science. In the human eye, light doesn't go straight to the photoreceptor cells. It has to pass through an entire layer of neurons and neural wiring first, before reaching the retina. Think about that for a second. It's like you built a camera and then placed all the wiring in front of the image sensor. A modern engineer looking at that design would probably immediately ask, why would you do that? Because normal engineering intuition says the wiring should be behind, not in front where the light comes in. But the human eye really works that way. Light passes through the layer of nerve cells, through a tiny network of blood vessels, and only then reaches the photoreceptors located at the back of the retina. And it gets even stranger. This system creates a real design flaw. You actually have a blind spot inside your eye. The nerve fibers from the retina have to bundle together into a large bundle called the optic nerve, and then pass through the retina to go to the brain. Right at that point, there are no photoreceptor cells at all, meaning you have a small hole in your field of vision right now. But you've never seen it. That's the amazing part. Your brain is constantly fixing the eye's errors without you noticing at all. It automatically takes information from the surroundings to fill in the gaps before your consciousness even knows what's happening. The brain is like someone editing video in real time so fast that you think the image is always perfect. Meanwhile, the octopus eye doesn't have this problem. Their retina is built in a much more logical direction. The photoreceptor cells face directly toward the light, and all the nerve wiring is behind it, so it doesn't create a blind spot. In other words, purely from a technical standpoint, the octopus eye seems cleaner and more efficient than the human eye. And this is the moment when biologists start to feel truly puzzled. If evolution could create a better system in the octopus, then why do vertebrates use a structure that sounds much clumsier? Why did nature choose this solution? That's exactly where evolution gets interesting. Evolution is not an engineer. It doesn't sit down with a perfect blueprint and build everything from scratch. It's like a repairman trying to patch together old parts while the machine still has to keep running. And that means history matters more than perfection. The human eye wasn't built in the most optimal way possible. It was built based on what our distant ancestors already had available hundreds of millions of years ago. This weird structure is actually a trace of an extremely ancient evolutionary history, a history that began with tiny creatures that existed before the dinosaurs, before the trees on land, and quite possibly before the time when eyes truly saw the world in the way we understand it today. For a long time, many people thought that such complex vision must have been a rare invention of evolution, like an extremely lucky accident that happened only once. But the more biologists studied, the more they realized that nature seems to have repeatedly reinvented eyes over and over again. Today, many biologists believe that vision has evolved independently dozens of times across different branches of life. Think about that. Nature keeps returning to the same idea because it's so effective it's almost impossible to ignore. Insects did it one way. Spiders did it another. Squids and octopuses developed their own direction. Vertebrates like us built an entirely different system. Some species created compound eyes with thousands of small units combined like a fly's eye. Others only have simple eye spots that sense light and dark. Some evolved camera eyes that are nearly like modern cameras. This is truly astonishing because many of these systems did not directly inherit from the same ancestor with a complete eye. They were built multiple times in many different places across the tree of life. And that's a sign of how powerful a survival advantage vision provides. The moment a creature could see its surroundings more clearly than its competitors, the whole game changed instantly. A predator that could detect motion from afar would hunt more effectively. A prey animal that noticed a shadow rushing toward it a fraction of a second earlier would have a higher chance of survival. Evolution loves those small differences. Just a tiny improvement in the ability to see could determine who lives and who disappears from the planet. And that created what I think is one of the most intense technological arms races that has ever existed on Earth. When predator species developed better vision, prey species were forced to respond. They needed better camouflage, faster running, smarter hiding. But then predators evolved even more sensitive eyes to overcome those new defenses. And so the arms race never stops. Vision doesn't just help creatures see the world, it forces the entire ecosystem to accelerate evolution. Some scientists even believe that the appearance of eyes played a major role in the Cambrian explosion, the period when life on Earth suddenly became much more diverse and complex. Before effective vision, the biological world was probably much slower. But when creatures started seeing each other, everything changed. Suddenly you needed armor, you needed speed, you needed color, you needed strategy. You needed a bigger brain to process the enormous amount of information the eyes were sending. I've always liked thinking about this as nature repeatedly reinventing the wheel. Not because nature lacks creativity, but because the wheel is simply too good a solution. If the laws of physics remain the same, evolution will repeatedly arrive at the same idea. Eyes are the same. Light is everywhere. The information contained in light is extremely valuable. Any creature that can exploit it more effectively will gain an almost immediate advantage. So evolution keeps returning to the same basic principle. Detect light, determine the direction of light, create images, track motion, process color. What's astonishing is not that eyes appeared once. What's astonishing is that they appeared over and over again, almost everywhere nature had a chance to experiment. And even though these visual systems are very different, they all show the same very important truth. The ability to see is one of the most powerful tools that life has ever invented. Modern eyes are not the product of a single moment of genius in evolution. They are the result of hundreds of millions of years of relentless survival competition on a planet where every creature was trying to see its opponent just a little earlier. What's even more interesting is that the very first eyes on Earth were actually almost blind. When we talk about eyes today, people usually think of sharp images, color, depth, and complex motion. But the truth is that the entire history of vision began with something much simpler. The first creatures that could sense light didn't see shapes. They didn't see faces. They didn't see color. They didn't see the world in any way that you or I would call seeing. They only knew one extremely basic thing: where was light and where was dark. Doesn't sound very impressive, right? But in the primitive world of hundreds of millions of years ago, even that tiny ability could create the difference between life and death. A creature that could detect the direction of light could float up near the surface where there was more energy. A creature that knew to avoid areas that were too bright could hide from predators better. Some simple creatures moved toward light to find food sources. Others avoided light because darker places were safer. And that's what I've always loved about evolution. It doesn't start with spectacular things. It starts with extremely small but useful advantages. If a small change helps you live just a little longer over a very long time, that change can shape the entire history of life. It all began with tiny light-sensitive proteins called opsins. When a photon of light hits them, their molecular shape changes and creates a chemical signal. That was almost the very first foundation of the entire history of vision on this planet. And what's astonishing is that a version of that same mechanism is still working in your eyes right now. Evolution doesn't erase the past. It builds new on top of the old. At first, these light-sensitive cells were scattered somewhat randomly across the surface of primitive creatures. But over time, some creatures began to concentrate them into small light-sensitive patches. This was extremely important, because when the light-sensitive cells clustered together, the creature began to determine the direction of light better. It no longer just knew there is light. It started to know where the light was coming from. That was the first step toward real vision. Imagine you're standing in a dark room and someone shines a flashlight in your face. If your entire body is equally light sensitive, you only know the environment got brighter. But if a small area concentrates stronger light sensors than the rest, you'll start to recognize the direction of the light source. Evolution worked pretty much the same way. These light-sensitive patches gradually became primitive eye spots. They still didn't create images, but they gave the creature better information about its surroundings than anything before. And then something very small but extremely important happened. The light-sensitive patches began to curve inward. It may not sound like much, but that change dramatically increased the ability to determine the direction of light. A flat surface only senses overall light. A curved surface began to create differences in light angles. That was the very first step leading to a primitive pinhole camera. And from here, everything started to accelerate. Evolution is not like an architect who sits down and designs a complete building from scratch. It's like someone adding one small brick at a time over hundreds of millions of years. That's what makes many people underestimate the power of evolution. They think on a human lifetime scale. But evolution works on a scale that's almost unimaginable. If a small change is beneficial, and you have tens of millions of years to accumulate such changes, extremely complex things begin to appear. Some eye spots became deeper. Some developed transparent membranes for protection in front. Some formed fluids that helped focus light better. None of those steps created modern eyes instantly. But each small step was a little more useful than the previous version. And that's all evolution needs. Just better than yesterday is enough. What makes evolution powerful is not speed. It's the enormous amount of time. Hundreds of millions of years of continuous experimentation. Billions of creatures born and then gone. Billions of small mutations kept or discarded. And when you look at the human eye today, with all its color, depth, motion, and extraordinary processing ability, the most astonishing thing is not how complex it is. The most astonishing thing is that the entire system began with cells that could barely see anything at all. Those primitive eye spots began to curve inward, forming structures called eye cups. At first glance, this change doesn't seem particularly special. It's just a surface that's slightly curved inward. But in the physics of light, that small change is extremely important. A flat surface only senses the total amount of light falling on it. But when the light-sensitive area curves inward, light coming from different angles starts to be separated. This helps the creature determine the direction of light much more accurately. Imagine you're standing outside in bright sunlight with your eyes closed. You can still sense which direction is brighter. But if you cup your hands around your eyes to form a small hollow, you can pinpoint the direction of the light source much more easily. Primitive eye cups worked very similarly. They still didn't create real images, but they began to provide spatial information about the surrounding environment. And evolution absolutely loves information. In nature, knowing what's happening even a little earlier than your competitor can determine whether you live another day or disappear completely from the tree of life. Then a truly fascinating step appeared. The eye cup became deeper and deeper, and the opening at the front became smaller and smaller. This is where physics began to work its magic. When light passes through a very small hole, the rays from different directions no longer blend together completely. They start to create a crude image on the back of the structure. That is the principle of the pinhole camera. You can try this yourself at home with a dark room and a small hole in a piece of cardboard. Light passing through the hole will project a blurry image of the outside world onto the opposite wall. No lens needed, no electronics, just the basic geometry of light. Evolution discovered this principle hundreds of millions of years before humans invented the camera. And this is what I always find coolest about nature. It doesn't know physics the way we write equations on a board, but the laws of physics still continuously select structures that work more effectively. An eye cup with a small hole that helped the creature distinguish motion and direction better would survive a little longer, so that structure was retained. There was no grand plan, just countless small experiments stretched across an enormous amount of time. Of course, the pinhole camera had problems. If the hole was too large, the image was blurry because light from many angles mixed together. If the hole was too small, the image was too dark because not enough light got in. Evolution then continued to patch together new solutions. Some creatures began to develop a layer of transparent fluid in front of the eye cup. At first, it was probably just simple protective tissue, but then physics intervened again. Any transparent material with the right shape began to bend light. And so the first primitive lenses appeared. And suddenly everything changed extremely quickly. The lenses allowed more light to enter while still keeping the image relatively sharp. That was a giant leap in the history of vision. Creatures could now see more clearly, farther, and faster. A predator with a better lens would detect motion before its competitors. A prey animal with sharper vision would recognize danger earlier. And so evolution accelerated once again. The important thing is that none of the steps in this entire process required a miracle. Each change was small. Each change was immediately useful to some degree. A shallow eye cup was a little more useful than a flat surface. A deeper eye cup was a little more useful than that. A transparent tissue layer improved the image a little more. Evolution didn't need to create an eagle's eye overnight. It only needed better than before. That is the real secret of evolution. Humans often assume evolution must create perfect structures instantly, which is why they find it hard to believe. But evolution doesn't work like an engineer building a spaceship. It's more like an old repairman trying to improve a machine using whatever parts are available. If a piece of tissue accidentally helped focus light 5% better, evolution would keep it. If the next generation improved it by another 3%, it would continue to be kept. Millions of tiny changes like that accumulated over almost unimaginable amounts of time. And then one day, you end up with a system so complex it can read text, look at the stars, and recognize other people's faces. That's what makes the human eye so miraculous to me. Not because it appeared perfect, but because this incredibly sophisticated biological camera system was built from countless small, almost ordinary steps. A spot of light-sensitive cells, a small hollow, a layer of transparent fluid, a small change in the way light is bent. Those tiny puzzle pieces were retained over hundreds of millions of years until nature accidentally created one of the most astonishing image processing systems that has ever existed on Earth. Moment vision began to work more effectively was also when this planet entered one of the most important phases in the entire history of life, the Cambrian explosion. If you look at the fossil record, something very strange happened around more than 500 million years ago. In a relatively short period by geological standards, life on Earth suddenly exploded in complexity. A whole series of new body plans appeared. Creatures began to have legs, spines, jaws, armor, predatory structures, and much more complex nervous systems. For many millions of years before that, life had been relatively simple and slow-moving. Then almost suddenly, the entire planet turned into a massive biological arms race. And many scientists believe that one of the biggest reasons for this change was eyes. That idea is sometimes called the light switch hypothesis. I've always liked that name because it sounds almost like someone turning on the lights in a dark room. Before effective vision, most creatures lived in a blurry, nearly blind world. They crawled slowly along the ocean floor, filter feeding, absorbing nutrients, or reacting to their environment in fairly simple ways. But then some creatures began to see each other, and that's when everything became chaotic in the true evolutionary sense. Imagine you're the first creature on the planet that can detect motion from a distance. Suddenly you no longer have to wait for food to drift by. You can actively hunt it. That changed the entire logic of life. A predator with eyes would be far more effective than one without. But as soon as that happened, prey species immediately faced a serious problem. If you didn't evolve a way to detect danger earlier, you would disappear very quickly. And that's when the arms race began to accelerate almost frantically. Creatures started developing higher speeds. Some evolved harder protective armor. Some learned to burrow into sand or hide under the seafloor. Some developed camouflage to blend into their surroundings. Others created sharp spines or thicker bodies to make themselves harder to eat. What's extremely interesting is that all those changes were interconnected. When predators got better, prey had to get better. When prey got better, predators had to upgrade again. Evolution was like an arms race that lasted hundreds of millions of years, with neither side allowed to stop. And eyes were near the center of that entire conflict. Before vision, Many creatures probably didn't need very large brains because the surrounding environment changed quite slowly. But when you started seeing motion, distance, speed, and direction of movement, you needed to process enormous amounts of information in extremely short times. That's when the nervous system began to become more complex. You could argue that vision didn't just change how creatures saw the world. It changed how brains evolved. This is truly astonishing if you think about it carefully. A few tiny light-sensitive cells ultimately helped create brains capable of building telescopes and asking questions about the origin of the universe. That is a chain of consequences that's almost unimaginable. The Cambrian explosion was like the moment nature discovered that information is power. The creature that collected information better would have a greater advantage. And light contains an enormous amount of information about the surrounding world. When evolution began to exploit light effectively, the entire planet essentially shifted to a new state. You began to see creatures with more symmetrical bodies for better orientation. You saw the appearance of more complex eyes in ancient trilobites and arthropods. You saw the first truly active predators darting through the ancient oceans instead of just waiting for random opportunities. And this also created a much more dangerous world. Before that, many creatures could live relatively peacefully by evolutionary standards. But when vision appeared, there was no truly safe place anymore. If someone could see you from afar, you needed to run faster, hide better, or fight more effectively. Evolution began to accelerate because every creature was forced to adapt continuously just to survive a little longer. That's why I think eyes may be one of the most influential inventions in the entire history of life on Earth. They didn't just allow creatures to see the world. They restructured the entire ecosystem of the planet. If vision had never appeared, Earth today would probably look completely different. There might never have been animals that are as fast, intelligent, and complex as they are now. Much of life might still consist of slow-moving creatures crawling along the seafloor in a nearly blind world. It's strange to think that the entire foundation of human civilization may ultimately trace back to a few tiny cells that were simply trying to distinguish light from darkness in the ancient ocean. Hundreds of millions of years ago, what puzzled biologists for a long time is that if evolution could create such wonderful visual systems, why was the human eye built in such a weird, almost backward way? This is exactly where the story starts to become truly interesting. Because the more closely you look at the eyes of vertebrates, the more you realize they don't resemble a perfectly optimized design from the start. In fact, they resemble a machine that has been repaired, patched, and improved continuously over hundreds of millions of years. In the human eye, the retina is the layer of tissue containing the light-sensitive cells called rods and cones. These are the cells that actually detect photons of light. It sounds simple until you know their location. They are not at the front where light enters. They are at the very back of the retina. That means light has to pass through nearly the entire network of neurons and blood vessels before reaching the cells that actually see. Think about how strange that is. You have an entire layer of nerve fibers sitting right in front of the image sensor. If you built a camera like that today, probably no one would buy it. I've always liked using this analogy because it clearly shows how weird the human eye is. Imagine you buy an extremely expensive camera, open it up, and discover that the entire wiring system is placed right in front of the sensor. You'd think the engineer who designed it must have had some problem. But that is exactly how vertebrate eyes work. Light passes through the cornea, through the lens, through multiple layers of neurons, and only finally reaches the rods and cones at the very back. And the story doesn't end there. All the nerve fibers from the retina have to gather into a large bundle called the optic nerve to transmit signals to the brain. But the optic nerve needs to pass through the retina to exit. That creates an area with no photoreceptors at all. That is your blind spot. You really do have a gap in your field of vision right now. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a completely literal physical sense. If light from an object falls at exact that point, Your eye receives no information at all. The best part is that you almost never notice it exists. The brain continuously fills in that gap with data from the surroundings. It guesses what should be there and automatically reconstructs a complete image before your consciousness even knows what happened. The brain is like an extremely fast video editor, constantly patching every flaw in the visual system in real time. And this makes the question extremely compelling. If vertebrate eyes seem to have such a flawed design, why didn't evolution fix it? Why not flip the retina around so light goes straight to the photoreceptors like in the octopus eye? The answer is that evolution doesn't work like a modern engineer. It doesn't erase the entire old blueprint and start over from scratch. Evolution only edits what already exists. If a system is good enough for the creature to survive and reproduce, evolution will usually keep it rather than build a more perfect system from zero. That is an extremely important point to understand. Evolution doesn't care about elegance. It doesn't care about what looks beautiful from a human technical perspective. It only cares about one single question. Does this structure help the creature live long enough to pass on its genes? If the answer is yes, that system can exist for hundreds of millions of years, even if it looks quite clumsy. And in fact, the human body is full of solutions like that. Our spine causes back pain because it was modified from four-legged ancestors. The food and air pathways cross, which allows humans to choke to death just from eating too fast. Knees, hips, nerves, all of them carry traces of temporary solutions retained over very long periods. The human eye is the same. It is not the product of a perfectly intelligent design. It is the product of history. And history is often messy. What I've always found interesting about evolution is that it's like an old repairman trying to upgrade a machine that is never allowed to be completely shut down. Every new change has to work with all the old parts that already exist. So you don't get perfection. You get layers of improvements stacked on top of each other over hundreds of millions of years. If you really want to understand why the human eye is built backward like this, we have to go very far back into the past. Back to the time when the ancient ancestors of vertebrates were still tiny creatures swimming in the primordial ocean, before the dinosaurs, before the trees on land, and before modern eyes existed in the way we know them today. Some modern studies suggest that the distant ancestors of vertebrates may once have possessed not only two eyes, but also a middle eye. This is where things start to sound a bit like science fiction. But the interesting part is that it's based on very serious evolutionary biology. When scientists tried to trace the origin of vertebrate eyes, they realized that this history may have begun with tiny worm-like creatures living in the ocean about 600 million years ago. These creatures didn't resemble fish, didn't resemble mammals, and were even very far from the concept of humans. They were tiny, soft-bodied creatures swimming in the ancient world where most life was still extremely primitive. But inside that simple body, evolution had probably already begun testing the first ideas that would lead to the entire modern visual system. Some researchers believe these ancient ancestors may have possessed both light-sensitive structures on the sides of the body and a light-sensing organ located near the center of the head. In other words, our ancestors may once have had a middle eye. I know it sounds a bit funny. If you imagine the distant ancestors of humans as a small creature with an eye in the middle of its forehead, it really does sound like a failed Cyclops version of evolution. But biology is often much stranger than human imagination. The important thing is that this middle eye was not initially used to see detailed images like modern eyes. It was probably mainly used to detect light from above. That was extremely useful in the ancient ocean. If the light suddenly changed, it might mean a predator was swimming above you. If the light intensity changed in cycles, you could recognize day and night. A light-sensing organ in the middle of the head was a fairly effective way to monitor the environment in a very primitive way. And then evolution continued to do what it always does: patch, modify, and reuse what already existed. Some scientists suggest that at some point in evolutionary history, Many ancient vertebrate ancestors shifted to a less mobile lifestyle. The environment changed, the climate changed, food sources changed. Some creatures began to live by filter feeding or lying relatively passive on the seafloor instead of swimming continuously. And when that happened, the ability to orient using complex side eyes may have become less important. This is something evolution does constantly. If a structure is no longer useful enough to offset the energy required to maintain it, evolution begins to inclinate it gradually. Eyes are extremely energy-expensive organs. So is the brain processing vision. If you no longer need a complex system, nature will often simplify it. We see this all the time in modern biology. Fish living in dark caves gradually lose their eyes. Many parasitic species lose complex nervous systems because they no longer need them. Evolution has no sentiment for any structure. It keeps what is useful and discards what is not. So it's possible that at some stage, the side eyes of distant ancestors became less important, while the central light sensing system continued to exist, because the creature still needed to know the light-dark cycles of the environment. This is extremely interesting, because it may explain why the modern vertebrate visual system carries so many weird traces. Evolution didn't build the human eye from scratch, like an engineer designing a new camera. It modified extremely ancient systems that had existed long before. And that's why history is so important in biology. When you look at the human eye, you're not just seeing a modern organ. You're seeing hundreds of millions of years of old versions stacked on top of each other. Structures that were once useful in the ancient ocean still leave traces in your brain and eyes today. What I've always found coolest about evolution is that it makes the human body much stranger rather than simpler. We often think of ourselves as the final design, but in reality our bodies are like a biological museum full of parts reused from ancient creatures to the point where they barely resemble us at all. And if this story is correct, then the history of the human eye may not have begun with an intelligent creature seeing the world clearly, but with a tiny worm-like creature with a light-sensing organ in the middle of its head in the primordial ocean about 600 million years ago. We often think of evolution as a continuous process of upgrading from simple to more complex, but many times in the history of life, creatures have actually lost abilities that their ancestors once had. And it seems this also happened with the distant ancestors of vertebrates. Some studies suggest that after the stage where ancient creatures began developing more complex light-sensing systems, many branches shifted to a nearly immobile lifestyle on the seafloor. Imagine tiny, soft-bodied creatures living in the ancient ocean, not chasing fast prey, not needing complex orientation, and mostly just filtering food particles drifting through the water. If you lived like that, the highly complex side eyes began to become quite expensive. Eyes are organs that consume an enormous amount of energy. So does the brain processing images. If the ability to see far or track motion no longer provided a significant survival advantage, evolution would begin to cut back that system. This is something nature does constantly. Evolution doesn't keep anything just because it's impressive. It only keeps what is still useful. We see this all the time in the modern world. There are species of fish that have lived in completely dark caves underground for millions of years. They gradually lost their eyes almost entirely. Some still have small eye sockets, but no longer have real vision. Why? Because in absolute darkness, vision provides no benefit at all. If eyes don't provide a survival advantage, but still consume energy to build and maintain, evolution will eliminate them bit by bit. It may sound ruthless, but evolution is extremely pragmatic. It's like a stingy manager always trying to remove anything no longer necessary from the machine. And something similar may have happened with our distant ancestors. When many ancient creatures shifted to a less mobile lifestyle on the ocean floor, the side eyes gradually became less important. But the light-sensing system in the middle of the head still held value. Even nearly immobile creatures still needed to know when it was light and when it was dark. They still needed to synchronize their biological activities with the day-night cycle. they still needed to sense changes in light in the surrounding environment. Therefore, the central light-sensitive cells could continue to exist while the more complex visual structures gradually declined. This is where the idea of the middle eye becomes truly interesting. There may have been a period when the central light-sensing system became the most important light-sensitive organ of vertebrate ancestors. Not to see sharp images, not to read text or recognize faces, just to sense light, darkness, and environmental cycles. And that may sound very simple, but sometimes simple systems last the longest in evolution because they are extremely stable and useful. What I've always loved about biology is that the modern body is full of traces of ancient lifestyles that we no longer live. The skeleton, nerves, immune system, the way embryos develop, all of them carry the history of distant ancestors that disappeared long ago. The human eye is the same. It is not the product of a final plan. It is like a series of modifications stacked on top of each other through countless different periods of the history of life. Evolution works much like a person who continuously removes parts of the machine if they are no longer needed, then later reuses some old components for new purposes when the environment changes again. That's why biology often looks very messy if you look deep enough. Structures don't disappear cleanly. They leave traces. They get modified. They get reused for different functions. And hundreds of millions of years later, you have a modern body full of temporary solutions from the ancient past. The strangest thing is that many things in your body today probably only exist because a tiny creature on the sea floor hundreds of millions of years ago needed them to survive one more day. And if this story is correct, then the history of the human eye is not just the history of evolving new structures. It is also the history of losing, retaining, and reusing extremely ancient structures through countless environmental changes on Earth. After millions of years of living fairly passively on the seafloor, many distant ancestors of vertebrates began returning to an active swimming lifestyle. The environment changed once again. Some creatures began having to move to find food, avoid predators, and orient themselves in a much more complex three-dimensional space. And as soon as that happened, simple light sensing was no longer enough. If you were swimming in the ancient ocean full of other creatures trying to eat you, knowing only light and dark wasn't enough to survive. You needed to know what was moving next to you. You needed to determine direction. You needed to see distance. In other words, evolution needed complex vision once again. But here's the most interesting part. Evolution did not go back to the starting point and build an entirely new system from scratch. It began modifying what already existed. The light-sensitive structures, once connected to the ancient middle eye, began to change. Some researchers suggest that these light-sensitive areas gradually developed into two new regions on either side of the head. Imagine a central cluster of light-sensitive cells beginning to stretch out to both sides over countless generations. Those new regions gradually became separate eye cups, and over hundreds of millions of years, they continued moving farther to the sides of the head to form the familiar paired eye system of modern vertebrates. This is extremely important because it may explain why vertebrate eyes carry so many weird characteristics. If the modern visual system was built by modifying an older light-sensitive structure rather than being completely redesigned, then many design flaws start to make sense. The inverted retina, for example, instead of light going directly to the photoreceptors, it has to pass through multiple layers of neurons first. That sounds illogical if you think like a modern engineer. But if the entire system was built by folding, stretching, and reusing existing ancient neural tissues, then that weird structure may simply be a historical consequence of how evolution repaired the old machine. This is why I always say evolution doesn't really design. It improvises. It patches things together. It's like a repairman trying to upgrade a car while the car is still driving down the road. If an old part works well enough, evolution will keep it and find ways to modify around it rather than replace the entire system. And that's why biology often looks extremely messy when you look deep enough for long enough. You see nerves taking very long detours instead of the shortest path. You see organs that work efficiently but are assembled in a clumsily confusing way. You see old structures reused for completely new functions. The human eye may be one of the clearest examples of that entire process. The primitive eye cups continued to become more complex. Lenses improved. The retina became more sophisticated. The brain processed images better. But this entire new system still carried the legacy of the old structure it was built from. Evolution doesn't erase history. It carries history with it. That's why the modern body resembles a vast biological archive, more than a perfectly designed machine. What makes me laugh the most is that if a modern engineer tried to explain this kind of design in a meeting, he would probably be asked why he didn't just start over from scratch for something cleaner. But evolution doesn't have that luxury. It cannot stop the entire system and begin again from zero. Every change has to work immediately in the body of a living creature. So instead of perfection, you get layers of improvements stacked on top of each other over enormous amounts of time. And somehow, that messy patching process ultimately created eyes that can look at the stars, read books, and observe their own evolutionary history. That is what I've always found most wonderful about science. When you look deep enough, things that look like flaws begin to tell the story of the ancient past that your body still carries with it. And if these hypotheses are correct, then the modern human eye is not an entirely new design. It is a structure that has been recycled, modified, and upgraded continuously through hundreds of millions of years of the history of life on Earth. One of the strangest parts of this entire story is that traces of the ancient middle eye may still lie inside your brain right now, not in a mystical way, not as supernatural energy or third eye awakening like the internet often says, but in a completely real biological sense. That structure is called the pineal gland. It is a tiny organ located near the center of the brain, almost hidden deep between the two hemispheres. If you look at it in anatomical images, it looks quite modest. It's just a small pine cone-shaped structure, which is also why it's called pineal. For many centuries, humans attributed all kinds of mystical meanings to the pineal gland. René Descartes once called it the seat of the soul. Some modern esoteric traditions view it as a gateway to supernatural perception. But what I find interesting is that the biological truth behind it is far stranger, without needing any additional mysticism. The pineal gland is an extremely important part of the body's circadian rhythm control system. It produces melatonin, the hormone that helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. When it gets dark, melatonin levels rise, making the body start to feel sleepy. When light appears in the morning, this system is suppressed, and the body becomes alert again, meaning that even if you don't realize it, your brain is continuously monitoring environmental light to control the entire internal biological clock. What's special is that the pineal gland doesn't operate independently. It is still directly linked to light signals entering the eyes. Light from the retina sends signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which then affects the pineal gland to adjust melatonin. In other words, your nervous system is still using light to control biological behavior in an extremely ancient way. When the sun sets, the body begins changing hormones, temperature, and neural state. When the sun rises, the entire system switches to daytime operating mode. This may sound normal to us because we live with it every day. But from an evolutionary perspective, this is an extremely ancient system that has continued operating almost continuously since the first primitive creatures began sensing light in the ancient ocean. And this is the truly fascinating part. The pineal gland has many features very similar to ancient light-sensitive tissue. In some modern animals like lizards and fish, structures similar to the pineal gland are still directly related to a real parietal eye or third eye. Some species even still have a small light-sensitive organ near the top of the head that detects light from above. This has led many scientists to believe that the pineal gland in modern vertebrates may be the remnant of the ancient middle eye system that once existed in distant ancestors. This is not a New Age hypothesis. It is the result of decades of research in neuroscience, embryology, and evolutionary biology. In fact, during embryonic development, the pineal gland and visual structures have quite deep developmental connections. That makes this idea even more plausible. And I've always found this the kind of story only science can create. People like to think of the third eye as something mystical beyond nature, but reality does something far stranger without needing any magic. It's possible that our brains really do still carry traces of an ancient light-sensing system from hundreds of millions of years ago. Not to see souls or other dimensions, just to track light, darkness, and the day-night cycle of this planet. What I like most is that evolution often doesn't erase history. It keeps the old layers beneath the new systems. Therefore, the modern body resembles a machine full of living fossils more than a completely new design. The pineal gland may be one of the strangest examples of that. A small organ deep inside the modern human brain is still performing a function directly related to light in a way that may have begun from the time the first primitive creatures swam in the ancient ocean. Think about that. Your brain right now may still be carrying traces of a visual system that appeared before the dinosaurs, before the trees on land, and before almost everything we call the modern world today. The third eye is not just a vague trace in the brain, but still exists quite clearly. This is where science starts to sound like something the internet loves to turn into mysticism. But the biological reality is far more interesting. Some species of lizards, frogs, fish, and ancient reptiles truly possess a structure called the parietal eye, sometimes also called the pineal eye. If you look closely at the top of the head of some lizard species, like the tuatara in New Zealand, you can see a small area that looks almost like a primitive eye, lying under a thin layer of skin. And what's astonishing is that it is not just a simple spot of light-sensitive cells. This structure actually has many components similar to a real eye. It has a simple retina, a tissue layer like a cornea, and even a primitive lens shape. Of course, it doesn't work like the main eyes. That lizard doesn't see sharp images with its third eye, like a science fiction superhero. But this organ still senses light very effectively. It is mainly used to track the day-night cycle, the position of the sun, and changes in light in the environment. Some species use it to regulate body temperature by determining the right time to bask or hide. Others use it to detect moving shadows from above, which could signal a predatory bird diving down. If you think about it, that's an extremely smart solution for a small creature living in the wild. You don't need to create high-resolution images. You just need to know if something suddenly blocks the light above your head. Evolution often does things like that. It doesn't try to create more technology than necessary. It only builds systems that are just good enough to increase survival chances. And the best part is that these structures show that the middle eye is not imagination or a mystical symbol, but a real part of vertebrate evolutionary history. When anatomists and developmental biologists studied ancient reptiles and their nervous systems, they began to realize that the pineal gland, parietal eye, and central light-sensitive organs have deep evolutionary connections. In other words, the idea that our distant ancestors once had a central light-sensing system is no longer wild speculation. It fits with a lot of evidence from embryology, neuroscience, and comparative anatomy. This is what I've always found humorous about science. People often like mystical stories because they sound profound, but reality is often stranger without needing any miracles. The internet likes to talk about third eye powers, higher consciousness, or secret spiritual gateways. But science offers a much more interesting story. The modern animal brain may still carry traces of an ancient light-sensing organ that appeared hundreds of millions of years ago in the primordial ocean. Honestly, I think that's the kind of story that is far more astonishing than any mystical idea. Humans don't have secret psychic abilities hidden in the brain. You won't open your pineal gland and suddenly read other people's thoughts. But we really do still carry the ancient biological machinery that once helped our distant ancestors track light, darkness, and the day-night cycle of this planet. And that is what I've always loved most about evolution. It never truly erases the past. It keeps the old layers of history beneath the new systems. Therefore, the modern body doesn't resemble a machine designed from scratch. It resembles a collection of parts reused over hundreds of millions of years. Some structures were upgraded, some were reduced, some changed function entirely, but traces of the past are still there if you know how to look deep enough. The parietal eye in modern reptiles is like a small window that allows us to look back to a very distant time in evolutionary history, when the first light-sensing systems were still experimenting with all kinds of weird designs before eventually leading to the modern eyes of vertebrates. And what I find most wonderful is that the human body today, no matter how modern and complex it seems, still contains many traces from ancient creatures that barely resemble us at all anymore. The thing that makes this entire system astonishing is that you don't see with what is called the third eye, but your brain is still using the ancient mechanism related to it every day without you almost noticing. The human circadian rhythm system operates continuously throughout life, like a silent biological clock running behind the scenes. Right now, your body is measuring environmental light to decide which hormones to release, how to change body temperature, and whether to prepare for an alert state or sleepiness. What's interesting is that most of us are almost never conscious that this process is happening. You just feel, I'm tired in the evening, or I'm more alert in the morning. But behind that simple feeling is an extremely ancient nervous system that is still operating almost exactly the way it once did in the primordial ocean hundreds of millions of years ago. When sunlight decreases at the end of the day, signals from the eyes to the brain begin to change. The pineal gland increases melatonin production, body temperature drops slightly. The nervous system gradually shifts into a rest state, and then you start to feel sleepy. In the morning, the entire process reverses. Sunlight suppresses melatonin, increases alertness, and synchronizes the body with the outside environment. It sounds normal because we live with this mechanism our whole lives. But it is actually extremely strange when viewed from an evolutionary perspective. Your brain is still operating based on signals in the same way ancient creatures once only needed to know when it was light and when it was dark in order to survive. That means even though modern humans build cities, the internet, satellites, and smartphones, our foundational nervous system still carries biological logic from an ancient world without electricity. And this is where everything starts to get a bit funny in a very human way. We are breaking that ancient system every night with artificial light. Hundreds of millions of years of evolution built the brain to understand that strong light means daytime and darkness means rest. Then, in just the last 100+ years, humans suddenly filled the planet with electric lights, LED screens, and artificial blue light all night long. Our ancient brain really doesn't know how to handle that. That's why phones and computer screens can disrupt sleep so strongly. The blue light from screens tricks the nervous system into thinking the sun is still out there. Melatonin is delayed. The biological clock gets thrown off. And then you lie in bed at 2 in the morning wondering why you're still wide awake, even though your body is exhausted. Jet lag is the best example of how strongly the brain depends on light signals. When you fly across multiple time zones too quickly, the body goes into a kind of temporary panic. The internal biological clock still thinks you're in the old place, while the environmental light outside says the opposite. Hormones, body temperature, hunger, and sleep cycles all get out of sync. Part of your brain is still living in New York, while the rest is suddenly thrown into Tokyo. That shows how tightly the human nervous system is still tied to the natural light cycle. Evolution simply hasn't updated fast enough to keep up with modern technology. Hundreds of millions of years of evolution built this biological system around the sun rising and setting each day. Then, in just a few extremely short generations, humans created an entirely new environment with artificial light operating all night. Our brains haven't had time to fully adapt to that. I've always liked thinking about this as the human nervous system being extremely old software running on modern hardware. You have a smartphone in your pocket, high-speed internet and jet airplanes, but deep down, your brain is still reacting to light, almost the same way your ancient ancestors once reacted in nature, hundreds of millions of years ago. And that is what I find coolest about biology. The modern body is not an entirely new machine. It is a collection of ancient systems that have been upgraded, patched, and reused over a very long time. Our third eye may not see the world like the main eyes, but in a much quieter way, it is still helping control the daily rhythm of modern human life right now. That is also why the question about the inverted retina in the human eye becomes so fascinating. If you only look at the eye as an independent engineering design, many things in it sound truly illogical. Why does light have to pass through a layer of neurons before reaching the photoreceptors? Why does a blind spot even exist? Why do the nerve fibers have to pierce through the retina instead of going around the back like in the octopus eye? But when you look at the human eye as the product of an extremely long and messy evolutionary history, everything starts to make a lot more sense. Some biologists suggest that the inverted retina may be a direct consequence of the vertebrate visual system developing from ancient light-sensitive structures related to the middle eye. In other words, the human eye wasn't built from scratch. It was modified from neural tissues that had existed long before. Evolution almost always does this. It reuses old structures rather than creating entirely new systems. And that is why creature bodies often contain many solutions that sound quite clumsy if viewed through modern technical logic. This is what biologists call historical constraints. Evolution is limited by the body's previous history. It cannot simply stop the system, remove all the components, and reassemble them from scratch in a more optimal way. Every change has to work on top of the old structures that already existed. That is like trying to repair a car while the car is still driving on the highway. You're not allowed to turn the engine off completely. You have to change each small part while still keeping the whole system working well enough for the creature to survive and reproduce. And that is why biology is often messy in a very special way. Nerves don't always take the shortest path. Bones don't always bear load in the most optimal way. Eyes aren't always assembled in the most logical direction. The human body is not the product of an all-powerful engineer sitting down with a perfect blueprint. It is the result of hundreds of millions of years of continuous modification, where each new version had to be built on the old version. What's interesting is that even though this system contains many design flaws, it still works extremely effectively. In fact, the human eye is one of the most powerful image processing systems that has ever appeared in nature. You can recognize a face in just a few thousandths of a second. You can see under rapidly changing light conditions. You can track tiny movements without almost realizing you're doing it. And most of this extraordinary ability doesn't lie in the eye. It lies in the brain. The human brain has evolved to fix a whole series of problems that the visual system creates. The blind spot, for example. You really do have an area where you see nothing at all in each eye, but the brain continuously takes data from the surroundings to fill in that gap before consciousness notices. The image on the retina is also always shaking slightly because the eyes are never completely still, but the brain automatically stabilizes it so the world looks steady. Environmental light changes constantly, yet you still feel the color of objects is fairly stable in most situations. The brain is processing all of this in real time at a speed that is almost unimaginable. That is what I've always found interesting about perception. We think we see the world directly, but in reality, the brain is reconstructing a highly edited version of reality from the imperfect, noisy, and sometimes completely missing data that the eyes send. In a sense, the brain is like a team of error-correcting engineers working continuously behind the scenes to make evolution's old visual system look more perfect than it actually is. And the funny thing is that most of the time it works so well that we never realize all the problems being fixed. That is why I think biology is much more interesting when you look at it as history rather than design. When you ask, why is the human eye assembled backward? The answer is not in looking for perfection. It lies in understanding the past. Evolution does not optimize from scratch like a modern engineer. It accumulates small changes over extremely long periods of time, keeping anything that is good enough to continue existing. And after hundreds of millions of years, that patching process ultimately created eyes that can look at the night sky, invent telescopes, and ask questions about their own origin. Perhaps that is the strangest thing in this entire story. What we call design in biology is often just history that has accumulated for so long that it starts to look like design. We often think of the eye as a window opening straight onto reality. Light comes in, and you see the world exactly as it is. But modern neuroscience shows that is not entirely true. In reality, what you experience as the image of the world is a model that the brain continuously reconstructs from incomplete, noisy, and sometimes entirely missing data. The eyes don't send a complete movie to the brain. They only send electrical signals. And the brain has to guess the rest. This may sound a bit scary at first, but it is also extremely interesting. The blind spot is the perfect example. You have an area that receives absolutely no visual data in each eye because the optic nerve pierces through the retina there. By normal logic, you should always see a small black hole floating in your field of vision, but you never see it. The brain continuously fills in the gap with surrounding information before consciousness notices. That means part of what you are seeing is actually being automatically invented by the brain to keep the world looking seamless. And the brain does this all the time, not just at the blind spot. Color, for example. We often think red, blue, or yellow is a fixed property of objects out there in the real world. But in reality, color is the way the brain interprets light wavelengths into subjective experience. There is no red floating out in space. There are only photons with different wavelengths hitting the retina. The brain turns those electrical signals into the sensation of color. Think about this carefully. The entire colorful world you experience every day is actually a kind of neural translation created by the brain. And it gets even stranger. Colors change continuously depending on the lighting environment. But the brain tries to keep them stable so reality looks more consistent. A red apple under sunlight actually reflects very different light than under a yellow kitchen bulb, but you still feel it is red. The brain is constantly editing the image to maintain a stable sense of the world. In many ways, vision is more like a computational process than a direct window onto reality. The brain continuously predicts what should appear next, and then compares that prediction with data from the eyes. If data is missing, it fills it in. If the image shakes, it stabilizes it. If light changes, it balances the colors. This makes perception one of the strangest fields in modern neuroscience, because you start to realize that what you call the world is actually a highly sophisticated, reconstructed version inside the brain. Optical illusions are a great proof of that. You can look at two perfectly equal straight lines, but the brain sees one as longer. You can look at a still image, but the brain feels it is moving. There are optical illusions where you see colors that don't actually exist in the picture. There are experiments where the brain completely invents borders, motion, or brightness that are not there in reality. And the scariest part is that you cannot turn off those illusions just by knowing they are fake. The brain still continues to construct reality in its own way. This shows that perception is not a passive process. The brain doesn't just receive data like a camera. It actively builds the experience of the world moment by moment. Some neuroscientists even describe the brain as a prediction machine, meaning most of the time the brain is guessing reality first and only using the eyes to check how accurate that prediction is. If you think about it, this makes perfect evolutionary sense. A creature that predicts dangerous motion earlier will react faster than one that has to wait to fully process all the data before acting. Evolution prefers speed over absolute perfection, and that means our perception is optimized for survival. not for displaying reality with 100% accuracy. I've always found this both wonderful and a bit funny. The brain sometimes resembles someone trying to fix a glitchy video in real time with tape and guesswork. It patches gaps. It stabilizes shaky images. It adjusts colors. It filters noise. And it does all of this so fast that you feel like you're looking at the world directly. But in reality, most of what you call reality has already been edited, restructured, and interpreted by the brain long before your consciousness even realizes anything is happening. The most interesting thing in this entire story is actually not that humans once had a middle eye. That idea sounds truly weird. But what is far more astonishing is that the history of hundreds of millions of years of evolution is still inside your body right now. That is what always makes me feel that biology goes far beyond ordinary human imagination. We often look at our bodies as a complete modern machine, as if they were freshly designed for today's world. But evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution does not erase the past and start over from scratch every time there is a new version. It builds new layers on top of old layers. It keeps parts that were once useful in the past and then modifies them for new purposes. Therefore, the modern body resembles a biological museum more than a clean technical product. Every system in you carries traces of ancient creatures that disappeared long ago. Your spine tells the story of four-legged ancestors. The early human embryo developed structures similar to the gill slits of fish. The nerves in the body sometimes take extremely illogical detours because they are stuck in the developmental history from distant ancestors. The human eye is the same. The pineal gland is the same. In fact, many structures in our body exist not because they are the most perfect possible solution, but because our ancestors once needed them in a completely different environment. This is an extremely important thing to understand about evolution. Biology is full of historical accidents. A small change that happened to be useful at one point can become locked into the system for hundreds of millions of years afterward. And then new changes have to continue building on the foundation of that old accident. That is why creature bodies are both wonderful and weird at the same time. If a modern engineer designed humans from scratch, he probably wouldn't place the retina backward. He wouldn't let the nerve fibers create a blind spot. He might design a better spine to avoid back pain or separate the food and air pathways so humans don't choke to death on a sandwich. But evolution is not an engineer. It does not optimize the entire system from zero. It only continuously modifies what is already available. That is why humans are not the final pinnacle of evolution, as many people like to imagine. Evolution has no final goal. It does not aim for perfection. It has no secret overall plan. This is the thing that many people find hardest to accept. We like to think everything must lead to some grand purpose. But natural selection is simply the result of countless small changes that were kept because they help the creature survive better in a specific environment at a specific time. If the environment changes, evolution changes direction. If conditions are different, the outcome is completely different. There is no final version. There is no perfect design waiting at the end of the road. I've always liked thinking about evolution as an endless process of improvisation, like a jazz band playing when no one really knows where the song is going. Each new part is built based on what exists in that moment. Some things work well and are kept. Some things fail and disappear. Some extremely clumsy solutions survive for millions of years simply because they are good enough. And over a very long time, that whole messy process creates something that looks like intelligent design from a distance. But when you look close enough for long enough, you begin to see the stitches of history still clearly visible everywhere in the creature's body. That is what makes me find evolution much more beautiful than the idea of a perfect machine. It makes life look more real, stranger, and richer in history. Every cell in your body is like it is carrying the memory of ancient oceans, primitive creatures, mass extinctions, and evolutionary experiments spanning hundreds of millions of years. And the funniest thing is that the more you understand evolution, the less normal the human body becomes. It becomes much stranger. You begin to realize you are not a clean modern machine, but a collection of ancient structures that have been reused, patched, and continuously edited throughout the almost unimaginable length of life's history on this planet. One of the biggest misconceptions about evolution is that many people think it always creates the best possible design. That sounds reasonable enough. If natural selection constantly removes bad traits and keeps good ones, then intuitively, creatures should eventually become almost perfect. But real-life biology doesn't work that neatly. Evolution doesn't optimize absolutely. It only creates solutions that are good enough for the creature to survive and reproduce in its current environment. That is an extremely important difference. A system doesn't need to be perfect to exist for millions of years. It only needs to work well enough most of the time. And when you start looking at the human body that way, you'll see it is full of very strange compromises. The blind spot in the eye is the clearest example. We just talked about how the brain has to constantly fix errors for the back-mounted retina. If designing from scratch, no one would choose that approach. But evolution kept it because the overall system still worked well enough. The human spine is another great example. Our distant ancestors walked on 4 legs. Then some primate branches began standing upright. But evolution didn't completely redesign the spine for bipedal posture. It only modified the old structure that was built for horizontal positioning. The result is that millions of modern people suffer from back pain almost their entire lives. Our spine works, but it is not optimized for standing upright for decades on end. Or look at the respiratory and digestive systems. In humans, the airway and food pathway cross in the throat. That means you can choke to death just because a piece of food goes the wrong way by a few centimeters. If a modern engineer designed a creature from scratch, he would probably separate these two systems completely for safety. But evolution didn't do that because it is limited by the body's previous history. This is the most important idea. Evolution never starts from zero. It always has to work with what already exists. And that makes biology both wonderful and messy at the same time. Natural selection is more like editing an old draft than creating a brand new blueprint. Imagine being tasked with upgrading an ancient city, thousands of years old, but never being allowed to tear everything down and rebuild. You have to keep the old roads, old buildings, and old electrical systems while trying to upgrade them bit by bit as millions of people continue living inside it every day. That is almost exactly how evolution works. It makes continuous repairs without ever truly rebooting the system. And that is why modern creatures are full of solutions that sound quite strange if viewed through pure technical logic. The eye works wonderfully, but has a blind spot. The spine is strong enough to support the body, but is very prone to pain. Human knees are extremely efficient for running, but easily injured after many years of use. Evolution doesn't care about perfect elegance. It cares about whether the creature lives long enough to pass on its genes. If the answer is yes, that system can exist for millions of years, even if it is full of flaws. The funny thing is that many people think science makes nature seem less miraculous. But for me, it is the complete opposite. A body built through hundreds of millions of years of patching, repairing, and reusing sounds far more interesting than the idea of a perfect machine designed instantly. Evolution sometimes resembles an overworked engineer on an extremely tight budget, trying to keep the system from collapsing, using any temporary solution that still works. And somehow that messy process ultimately created birds that can fly across oceans, whales that can communicate across thousands of kilometers of seawater, and a human brain capable of sitting and thinking about its own evolutionary origin. That is what makes biology feel much more real to me. It is not perfect. It is full of traces of history, accidents, and temporary solutions. But that is exactly what makes life stranger and more astonishing than any imaginary flawless design. Vision truly changed nearly the entire biological history of this planet. If you go back to the time before complex vision appeared, Earth was probably a very different place. Life back then was much simpler, much slower, and mostly took place in a world that was almost blind. Creatures reacted to chemicals, water currents, or direct physical contact. But they didn't truly see each other the way modern animals do today. Then light began to become the most important source of biological information on the planet, and everything accelerated almost immediately. The moment a creature could detect motion from a distance, the entire logic of life changed. Suddenly, active hunting became possible. You no longer had to wait for food to drift by accidentally. You could pursue it. And as soon as that happened, prey were also forced to change in order to survive. That was when strategy appeared. That was when camouflage began to become extremely valuable. A creature that blended into its environment would survive longer than one that was easy to see. Some species evolved colors to intimidate predators. Others developed patterns to fool the perception of their opponents. Some marine creatures created nearly invisible transparent bodies underwater. Evolution suddenly turned this planet into a massive information war, where every creature was trying to see the other before being seen. And that didn't just change hunting. It also changed social behavior. When creatures began seeing each other more clearly, visual communication became extremely important. Birds use colors to attract mates. Primates use facial expressions to read emotions. Humans eventually built entire civilizations based on visual symbols, writing, screens, and light. If you think about it, most of our modern life revolves around vision. You drive with your eyes. You read with your eyes. You watch movies with your eyes. You recognize loved ones' faces with your eyes. Even the modern internet is largely a system for transmitting images and visual symbols. What's interesting is that all of that may have started from a few simple light-sensitive cells in the ancient ocean. And as vision became stronger, animal brains also began to develop faster. This is an extremely important part. Eyes generate enormous amounts of data. A creature that sees better needs a better nervous system to process that information. It needs to recognize fast motion, estimate distance, analyze color, track multiple objects at once. And then the brain began to grow larger, more complex, and faster. In many ways, vision was one of the major drivers behind the evolution of intelligence. If you think of the brain as an information processing system, then eyes are one of the most powerful data sources that has ever appeared in the history of life. That is why many of the smartest animals on Earth also possess extremely advanced visual systems. Birds of prey, octopuses, dolphins, primates, all of them rely heavily on image processing. In fact, one could argue that modern human civilization is an indirect consequence of the vision arms race that began hundreds of millions of years ago. Writing exists because we can see symbols. Art exists because we process images. Telescopes, microscopes, cameras, and computer screens all expand the capabilities of the ancient biological visual system that evolution built in our heads. I've always liked thinking of eyes as the first internet of the living world. Before complex language, before technology, light had already become the fastest information transmission system between creatures and their environment. A single photon reflected from a predator could save your life. A small change in color could determine reproductive success. An extremely fast movement at the edge of your vision could trigger the entire nervous system to react in a few thousandths of a second. Vision essentially turned this planet into a vast biological information network. And what I find strangest is how rarely we realize how much our entire modern civilization depends on it. Cities are built around light. Technology is built around screens. Social communication depends on facial expressions and images. We live in a world profoundly shaped by the brain's ability to turn light into perception. If vision had never appeared, Earth would probably be completely unrecognizable to us. There might be no fast predatory animals. There might be no brains as large as we have today. There might never have been art, writing, or image-based civilizations. All of that may have begun from the first moment an ancient creature recognized the difference between light and darkness in the primordial ocean hundreds of millions of years ago. There is one thing humans have done in almost every era. Whenever we encounter something we don't fully understand, we often turn it into something mystical. I understand why that happens. The human brain hates gaps in knowledge. We like complete answers, even if they are wrong. And that is why ideas like the third eye are almost always pulled towards spirituality, supernatural energy, or some kind of secret mystical abilities. The internet is full of stories about awakening, higher dimensions, and lost ancient mind powers. But what I've always found interesting is that the real biology behind this story is far stranger, without needing to add any magic at all. Real-life reality often surpasses human imagination in a very different way. Think about this. Evolution really did leave traces of an ancient light-sensing system inside the modern brain. Not as a symbol, not as a metaphor. A real biological organ related to detecting light and regulating circadian rhythms is still operating in your head right now. Some modern reptile species still retain a clearer version of that structure in the form of a parietal eye. The whole story sounds like science fiction, but it comes from completely serious anatomy, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. That is what I've always loved about science. It doesn't destroy wonder. It makes reality much stranger. When I was a child, many people thought science was just a process of removing mystery from the world with dry formulas. But my experience has always been the opposite. The more you understand physics or biology, the stranger the universe becomes. A flower doesn't become less beautiful when you learn about DNA and evolution. It becomes almost unbelievable. The human brain doesn't become less interesting when you understand neurons and synapses. It becomes far more astonishing. And eyes are the same. They are no longer just a vague, poetic window to the soul. They become the product of hundreds of millions of years of continuous biological experimentation, where simple light-detecting cells ultimately led to a nervous system capable of looking at the night sky and wondering how it exists. The best part is that every new discovery in biology usually doesn't end the story. It opens up even bigger questions. We discover the pineal gland's relation to circadian rhythm, then wonder exactly how those ancient light-sensing systems developed. We understand that perception is the brain constructing reality, then face deeper questions about consciousness and subjective experience. Science rarely gives you a complete ending. It is like opening a door that leads to a much larger room. And honestly, I think that is the most beautiful thing about science. It allows us to be amazed without abandoning logic. You don't need to invent anything supernatural to feel astonished by reality. Reality itself is already strange enough. A species of animal on this tiny planet evolved from worm-like creatures in the ancient ocean, developed a nervous system complex enough to create mathematics, music, and telescopes, and then began studying the very origin of its own brain. If that isn't astonishing enough, I don't know what is. I've always thought curiosity is far more important than certainty. One of the most powerful phrases in science is sometimes simply, "I don't know yet." Many people feel uncomfortable with uncertainty. They want final answers immediately. But in science, "I don't know yet" is often the most interesting place to stand. That is where new discoveries begin. The danger is not lacking answers. The danger is pretending you already have all the answers. And the history of science is full of moments when humans realized reality was far more complex than they had imagined. Earth is not the center of the universe. Time is not absolute. Matter is mostly empty space. The brain doesn't see reality directly, but constructs a model of reality. Each time science advances, the world usually doesn't become simpler. It becomes stranger. That is true for physics, for evolution, and for our own eyes. Perhaps the most wonderful thing about the third eye story is not that our ancient ancestors once had a central light-sensing system. The most wonderful thing is that real-life reality turned out to be stranger, deeper, and richer in history than any modern myth humans have ever imagined. Before this, they just seemed like such familiar tools that they were almost invisible. You wake up, open your eyes, look at the world, and never really think much about it. But now you know that eyes are not just viewings, devices. They are living evolutionary history. They are proof that the human body was not built in one single perfect moment, but was patched, modified, and reused continuously over hundreds of millions of years. What I find coolest is that the so-called third eye turned out not to be some secret mystical energy at all. It is much more interesting than that. It is a real trace of ancient biological history that still lies inside the modern brain. A part of the light-sensing system that once helped distant ancestors track light in the primordial ocean still influences your sleep, hormones, and circadian rhythm every day. That sounds almost unbelievable if you stop and think about it carefully. The human body is like a machine carrying the memory of hundreds of millions of years of life's history. Every structure in you has a past. Your eyes carry the past of the first light-sensitive cells. Your spine carries traces of four-legged creatures. Your brain carries layers of ancient nervous systems stacked on top of each other through countless evolutionary periods. We often think of ourselves as the modern version, but in reality our bodies are much more like a living biological museum. And the strange thing is that all those old patched-up systems somehow still work extremely effectively. Evolution doesn't create perfection. It creates systems that are good enough to continue existing. That is very important. There is no final design. There is no absolutely optimal blueprint. There are structures that were kept because they worked a little better than the previous version. Then millions of small changes accumulated over enormous amounts of time to create systems so complex that they start to look like perfect design from a distance. But when you look close enough, you still see the stitches of history everywhere. The human eye has a blind spot. The retina is mounted backward. The brain has to continuously fix perception errors. The nervous system still reacts to light, as if we were still living in the ancient savannah with no phones or LED lights. But what is astonishing is that all of those things still coordinate well enough to allow a small animal species on this planet to build civilizations, invent science, and study itself. I think that is what makes science more beautiful than any myth. The deeper you explore, the less simple reality becomes. It becomes stranger. Quantum mechanics is stranger than human intuition. Space-time is stranger than human intuition. Evolution is the same. Nature has no obligation to be reasonable in the way our brains, evolved to hunt on the African savannah, expect. And I've always loved that. One of the greatest things about science is that it teaches us humility before reality. It reminds us that human intuition is very limited. We evolved to survive, not to make nature easy to understand. That is why so many things that are truly true about the universe sound completely counterintuitive at first. Matter is mostly empty space. Time is not absolute. The brain does not see reality directly, but constructs a model of reality. The human eye works with a system that sounds quite flawed, but is still extremely effective. And somewhere deep in your brain, there are still traces of an ancient light-sensing organ from hundreds of millions of years ago. If someone told this entire story as science fiction, many people would probably think it was too strange to be true. But that is exactly what I love about science. It allows us to confront the strangest reality without having to invent anything supernatural. Curiosity is the most important thing in the entire process, not certainty, not the feeling that you already know everything. Curiosity makes humans look at the most familiar things like eyes and ask, wait, why is it built this way? And from that small question, we trace back to the ancient ocean, to primitive worm-like creatures, to the first light-sensitive cells, to the history of perception, consciousness, and the brain. I've always thought science is at its most beautiful when it makes us look at the ordinary world with completely new eyes. After this conversation, perhaps you will never look at your own eyes the same way again. You will know that behind every image you see are hundreds of millions of years of evolution, billions of neurons fixing reality in real time, and traces of ancient biological systems still operating inside the modern brain. And the most wonderful thing is that even though science has discovered so much, we have only just touched the surface. The more we understand reality, the deeper, stranger, and more beautiful it becomes. Perhaps that is the biggest lesson in this entire story. Reality does not become less mysterious when we understand it. it becomes mysterious in a much more real way. And perhaps the greatest thing about science is this: real-life reality is almost always stranger than anything humans have ever imagined. If you like stories where science makes reality stranger than science fiction, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys into the deepest secrets of the universe and the human brain. Thank you for joining me today in exploring one of the strangest stories of evolution, and I'll see you in the next video.